One of our real commitments in our approach to this project, and this is the way my firm approaches most planning projects, is that we don't believe that we should go off over here as experts and come up with a plan and then come back to the public and say, here's the plan, what do you think? We need the public and the community much more actively involved in creating the plan. And that's why we've designed a process in which there's an extraordinary amount of communication with the public at several stages. So initially, where things stand at the end of January is that we've released a report called Transit Choices, which is designed to help anyone think through what the real situation is in Wake County, what the demands are, what the needs are, but then also to think through some of the really difficult trade-offs that are going to have to be made, and I'll talk about them in a moment. The next thing we're going to do is develop 4 alternatives, 4 different scenarios for what the plan might look like. These scenarios will all have the same cost, but for example, one of them may include a light rail line and others may not. One of them may include the commuter rail line and others may not. And you'll get to see the total network of how the whole network changes based on these technology choices and based on other trade-offs that we may be wanting to illustrate. So when we go out to the public with a series of scenarios, we're not going to tell you that we prefer one of them, because I, as a consultant, don't prefer one of them. My job is entirely to help you, the people of Wake County, develop the plan that you want and that serves your values, not my value. So the role of these multiple scenarios will be that they will all be possible, but they will clearly be very different. They will reflect different sets of priorities, and that will give everyone an opportunity, by reacting to those scenarios, to express their view about the real trade-offs that have to be made. The whole point of this is to engage you, the people of Wake County, not just by asking you what you want. It's easy to ask people what they want, but the real challenge is to ask you, how would you make the actual trade-offs that have to be made? How would you make the actual choices that have to be made between different things that you want? And that's the point of the scenario approach. Once we have public feedback on how people feel about the different scenarios, the final plan will probably be some combination of those scenarios based on on what the public's priorities are as they've expressed them in response to them. So the whole process is really about integrating our communication with the public with the development of the plan. All the way through, that's what we're trying to do, so that you have had ample opportunity to participate at several stages in expressing your views about the choices the plan needs to make. There's an enormous renaissance in public transit going on in this country. There's suddenly a great increase in interest in public transit, and there's also a steady increase in ridership over much of the country right now. And the other thing that's happened that's important to notice is that the growth of driving in America has stopped. For most of my lifetime, people have driven more and more every year than the year before, but that stopped in 2004, and for the last 10 years, it hasn't been growing, it's been flat. So something's changing. Let's look at some of the elements of what's changing. First of all, we have the emergence of personal technology, our ability to be on our phones all the time engaged with something else when we're traveling or when we're doing anything else. So one of the things that's starting to change now is that people who value their travel time and who want to be working while they're traveling are realizing that public transit is actually the way to do that, because it's really not safe to be doing that if you have to be watching the road. That's causing a big shift in the interest in public transit, because people so want to be on their phones all the time. The next point is really economic. Owning a car is very expensive, maintaining a car. If the public transit is good enough that say a moderate to low income family can share a single car within the family instead of needing a car for every adult, that's fundamentally liberating to them and gives them an opportunity to spend that money on something that's going to be better for them and better for our society, like, for example, education that helps someone in that situation get a better job or have a better career. So the opportunity for people to own fewer cars, just the opportunity to do that, is an important way to help people give a leg up to get out of low-income circumstances. Finally, and third, the free market is telling us that many people increasingly want to live in high-density urban environments. places that are dense and urban and walkable and where there's plenty of stuff close by in walking distance are becoming extremely expensive. And that's the market's way of telling us that we need to build more of them and that that's what people want now. It's not what everybody wants, and there'll be plenty of room in Wake County for everyone to have whatever kind of house they want. But this is what the market is telling us we need to be building more of. Public transit is crucial for those kinds of places. Those dense urban environments don't have room for everyone to have a car. You can't afford to build affordable housing for people there if you have to have a parking space for every unit. But also, public transit thrives in those environments because there are so many people around every stop, so many people going the same general direction, that it's easy to fill buses and trains. So the general demand for more urban styles of living, which is why downtown Raleigh is covered with construction cranes right now, is in fact something that means you're going to need a more robust public transit system so that the people who are attracted to those places and who want to come to Wake County because those places exist will also be able to get around without needing so many cars that those inner city places cease to function. The conversation you're having in Wake County and the kinds of debates that you're having in Wake County are entirely typical and normal. I understand that Wake County is unique in all kinds of ways, but the basic shape of the conversation, the nature of the points of view, the nature of the concerns being expressed, it's all pretty similar to what I deal with as I go from city to city all over North America and to some extent around the world. Lots of different communities are realizing that they need a different approach to public transit, one that makes public transit a reasonable choice for a significant and diverse share of the population, that they need public transit to not be associated with low income, but to be something that many different kinds of people can find useful. They're having some difficult conversations about some of the trade-offs that public transit planning requires. But there's nothing particularly unusual about the debate that you're having. There's nothing particularly unusual about how difficult it is. It's difficult anywhere in the United States to develop public transit, particularly because we are so used to cars being the dominant mode of transportation that that assumption has been built into so many of the default ways that we think about things that it really does require some significant work to understand what public transit is, how it's different from car-based planning, and but also then to understand why it's so increasingly in demand now. Another trade-off to think about, rather than simply having a conversation about whether we must have light rail or whether we must have commuter rail, another interesting way to think about it is simply, do we want to spend more of our money on infrastructure or on running service? So light rail is an example of a huge expensive piece of infrastructure. It gives you a very nice experience when you're finished with it. It's a very nice thing to ride. On the other hand, when you spend that much money on infrastructure, you have less money to spend on sheer service. So what you're likely to see is that a scenario that includes light rail will have a much smaller bus network covering the rest of the county and meeting the other needs, whereas a scenario that does not have light rail will have more of a bus network, going more places, running more frequently, running longer hours. That's the kind of actual trade-off that has to be made, because the money we spend on the infrastructure is money we can't spend on the service. So that's why frequently it may turn out that the network that is best at getting everyone where they're going is not necessarily the one that includes the most expensive piece of infrastructure. I've been designing transit systems as a consultant for over 20 years now, and one of the most fundamental problems we often encounter is that when we're designing transit systems, we're often being asked to do contradictory things. So I've learned to actually point out the contradiction and encourage communities to actually think about it. And the biggest problem works like this. Many people think that the primary goal of public transit is to carry as many riders as possible. Many people who are critical of transit write articles about transit in which they assume that the low ridership of some bus service means that the transit system is failing. But in fact, that's only one of the goals of transit, and transit agencies are asked to do something else which is entirely the opposite. So we have a ridership goal over here, just carry as many people as possible. We also have a competing set of goals over here, which are about what I call coverage. And when we're pursuing coverage, what we're doing is providing service so that it's available to people regardless of whether they use it. Think about why you'd want to do each of those things. A ridership goal means that if you maximize the number of riders, well, it's the business-like thing to do in that that gives you the most fare revenue, but it's also the environmentalist thing to do because the more people are on the buses, the fewer people are in cars, and all of the environmental benefits of transit arise from that. High ridership networks also tend to be the networks that are most supportive of dense urban styles of development because they tend to focus on them. But there are also excellent reasons that transit agencies are expected to provide coverage. First of all, many people out there with extremely severe needs will request transit service because they depend on it very heavily. There may not be very many of those people, but they need it very badly. And many people believe that transit should serve that. It's not what a business would do. A business wouldn't do that because there aren't very many people using the service. But many people feel that public transit does have an obligation to provide those kinds of services. Intentionally, predictably low ridership service that goes into places where people need the service badly, but where we know ridership will be low. So if you look at these images, a high ridership system tends to be one that concentrates very intensely on the markets where it can really succeed. So in Raleigh, in Wake County, for example, a very high ridership network might serve the Raleigh to Cary to Morrisville corridor and to RTP corridor very intensely. It might have very intense service around inner city Raleigh and NC State where there's lots of demand, but there might be no service to Wake Forest or Zebulon or possibly even to Apex, because it would concentrate very narrowly on the places where it would get the most ridership rather than feeling any obligation to cover the entire county. By contrast, a coverage-oriented network would be one that tends to spread out a little bit of service everywhere. There would be lots and lots of routes going to all the corners of the county. However, when we spread it out, we're also spreading it thin. A coverage network, because it covers such a large area, can't afford to run very frequent service anywhere. As a result, it's not as useful to a lot of people, and as a result, the overall ridership is lower. There's nothing wrong with pursuing ridership. There's nothing wrong with pursuing coverage, but they are opposites. And so what we have to do in a plan is think about where we want to come down on the spectrum between those two competing types of goals. What I've done with many other transit agencies is encourage them to adopt a goal that says something like, this percentage of our budget is to be used on high ridership service, and we'll evaluate the results based on ridership. But this percentage of our budget is really not about ridership. This percentage of our budget is about coverage. It's about getting to people who need them. It's about getting to every city in the county, regardless of whether the ridership will be high there. It's about making sure that people feel included, making sure that the service is available. It's your decision as the people of Wake County, speaking ultimately through your commissioners, where you want to come down on that trade-off. Let me just say a word about the Transit Choices document that's just come out. What this document does is to basically lay out the context in which Wake County's decisions will need to be made. The document doesn't make any recommendations at all. All it does is to describe the situation that is our starting point for our conversation. So it steps you through a little bit of the history, but then it takes you in detail through a lot of maps that describe what's going on in Wake County now. Where do people live? Where do they work? How are they getting around? What do we know about income and the other key factors that affect transit ridership? So there's just a lot of information there. There's a lot of interesting information, too, about how Wake County service currently stacks up against some of the cities around the country which you probably think of as competitors in the context of, for example, if you think of tech industry intensive state capital regions with big universities, your obvious peers are cities like Austin or Madison, both of which have much more intensive public transit than Wake County does now. On the other hand, if you choose to compare yourselves to Columbia, South Carolina, or Richmond, Virginia, you're doing very well. So it depends on what that invites an interesting conversation about what cities do you want to be like, or do you want to be compared to? That's a question about your vision of what you want the county to be. Then we talk through some of what the technology options are. We talk through the basic, what are buses and what is light rail and so on. We also talk through what I call the transit toolbox. And the transit toolbox is a way to visualize what are the different kinds of service before we start talking about technology. So for example, we talk very clearly about what it means to run frequent, high-frequency, rapid all-day service, which is not which doesn't mean light rail. It means light rail or bus rapid transit or any of a number of other ways of doing that. The technology question comes later, but let's visualize the service first, because the service is what determines whether and when you get where you're going and whether you can trust it. So the Transit Toolbox chapter talks through that, and that's very helpful in thinking through what the real service options are and to understand why service is something different from technology. And then finally, the Transit Choices chapter talks you through the ridership coverage trade-off, which I just talked about, and also a little bit about the trade-off between infrastructure and service. It helps you to think about some of the real difficult choices between things that we want that have to be made in the course of this process and that we'll be wanting your opinions on throughout the process.